Today, I will discuss intergenerational trauma and happiness with Dr. Pilar Jennings, licensed psychoanalyst from New York, USA. Hello, Pilar, and very welcome to our Open to Happiness podcast.
Thank you so much, Nicoletta. It's good to be here with you.
It's amazing indeed. I'm so looking forward to discuss with you about your life experience and work experience and learn a bit more about how you integrate psychoanalysis and the Buddhist teachings in your trauma work. So I can't wait to dive in. But before we get to that stage, can we find out a little bit more about you? Who are you and how was your journey in life so far?
Sure, thank you. Well, perhaps a place to begin is that I'm a third generation New Yorker on my father's side, and I live and I practice in New York City. My mother is Peruvian, born and raised outside of Lima, and my father's of Scottish descent. So I feel like I've been influenced by very different points of view, very different cultures. That's something that I feel like I've tried to bring into my clinical work as well, some sensitivity to how we understand life depending on where we are in the world and what's happening to us. And I'm a long-term student of the Buddhism and Buddhist psychology, and have been teaching Buddhist psychology for some time. And so that's also a central part of who I am and how I practice as a therapist.
So beautiful. I love the blend in your origins, in your ancestry. And I'd love to ask a bit more about shamanism and different other practices from your mother's place, maybe at some point. And thank you so much for sharing what shaped you, where you're coming from. Because definitely it impacts your work in the same way my origins impact my work. I'd like to maybe move the conversation in the area of happiness now. What's your relationship with happiness? Have you been happy through life? Have you been through hardship? Whatever you feel comfortable to share with us.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, I think the question of happiness is so important because it's what everybody longs for. Whether they'll be conscious of that longing or not, I think it is part of the human condition to wish for, to long for, to strive for happiness. So it is something that I think about quite a bit. Also in my work, I spend a good part of my day with people who are coming in to work with me as a therapist. Even though people come to therapy because they're suffering, what they're longing for is the end of that suffering and then the well-being to take over. So I've also thought about it for personal reasons. I think early in life, I became aware that suffering is powerful and pervasive. It had something to do with my little family, where there was a lot of love, but it wasn't able to remain intact. And so I think from a pretty early stage in life, I was aware of the difference between feeling happy, which often involved feeling close to people I love, or feeling a sense of safety or security, or a sense that the people I love want me to be happy and they're there, and then losing that. And then the loss became, over time, a source of awakening that we can work with our suffering to restore happiness. But it does take work.
It does, indeed.
Yeah.
So what is happiness, really? How do you define happiness, or how do you comprehend happiness? How do you make sense of this concept?
Yeah. I mean, on an intuitive level, I think happiness has a lot to do with feeling that we can be who we authentically are and still be in relationship. often there's some sense that we can be in relationship if we modify who we are in order to accommodate the expectation of others, or we can be who we authentically are and stay outside of close relationship. But in my experience, when we're starting to rest in who we are, which means all sorts of things, our temperament, our preferences, our needs, our personality, and still feel that other people can be loving and caring and accepting and present, that's happiness. In Buddhist psychology, happiness and love are linked. So love is the expression of the wish for others to be happy. And it makes sense, right? When you see a loving parent observe a child who's really thriving and doing well, right? The parent is happy. The parent is happy when the child is happy. And so that does make sense to me, that love and happiness are linked. We need to feel we can be loved as we are, right? That we don't have to hide parts of ourselves in order to receive that love, or get rid of parts of ourselves. And that we can do that for others, right? I think we feel happiest when we are loving other people, when we're allowing them to be who they authentically are and staying, even if it's difficult, right? Which doesn't mean that we need to tolerate every difficulty, but that we need to ride the waves of difficulty as we're working with people, right? As we're working with the nature of relationship with either two people or two groups who are staying connected to who they are.
And that can be difficult, really, because when we go through hardship and pain, it makes it quite hard to sustain that feeling of love towards yourself, towards the others. It's the egoic mind that steps in and plays the victim role and wants to take over and create conflict, isn't it?
Yes, that's right. Yeah, it does seem very, very human and common that when we're suffering, it's difficult to just feel the suffering without some part narrating what's going on, and usually blaming ourselves or blaming someone else for what's going on. And then getting lost in that suffering, getting a little overly identified with it. And I say that with a lot of compassion, because we both know that people can suffer acutely, right? People can lose their homes and their families and their country, their sense of identity. They can lose their health, parts of the body. I mean, it's extraordinary how much we can suffer. But in Buddhist psychology, it's suggested if we allow for or learn to work with that suffering, but without then adding an extra layer of self-attack. I'm suffering because I'm so crazy, or I'm suffering because I'm such a problem. I'm suffering because I'm not like my sister, or I'm not the child my mother wanted, right? If we're not getting lost in that self-attack, then there's the opportunity to actually feel a little more compassion, a little more tenderness in response to the suffering. And that might help us down the road restore well-being, restore happiness.
I absolutely value and love the Buddhist teachings. Can't wait to hear a bit more about how we can use the Buddhist teachings in our day-to-day life. But before we get there, Pilar, how did you become interested in healing and helping others and studying Buddhist psychology and integrating Buddhist teachings in your work, in your psychotherapy work?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think for a few reasons. When I was a young adult, I started to realize that while my personal suffering at times was difficult and left me feeling confused about childhood and confused about how to become an adult or a well adult, that I could work with that suffering. I could do something with it that would actually allow me to become more attuned to other people's suffering. And I think this is always the opportunity with personal suffering, that we can use it as an inroad to the collective. Right? And in every faith tradition, there are lots of stories of someone who's going through real hardship and they're frantic. But then they start to realize that they're situated in the human family, that there are many others who can join them, who know about that suffering. So that was an initial curiosity. And then when I went into my higher education and I was studying medical anthropology and learning about how people talk about pain, depending on their cultural imprints, I realized then I wanted to sit with a human being and hear about their pain rather than to study it from a distance. And that became the real call.
So beautiful. In a way, you're talking about using this opportunity that you have to, when you face your suffering, when you confront what's going on inside of you, when you permit yourself to be who you truly are and stop faking life and stop presenting yourself other than you are, when you probably build that sense of strength to really look behind and accept this pain, understand it, accept it, and eventually extract some meaning from it. I absolutely loved how you mentioned the journey from the individual to the collective, because I feel that we can all learn lessons. I think it's a Buddhist teaching that says this was not a sentence, it was a lesson for you. So we can learn these lessons. Our pain hasn't just happened for nothing. It came to lead us somewhere, to maybe remove some lenses and some veils that we have on our eyes and see to different depths within our being, and then share our learnings with all of the others and contribute to elevating the collective consciousness. So lovely when you talk about that. So you're studying medical anthropology and then Buddhism, and you want to be sitting with people, be close to people. You want the real thing, not the imagined thing. You want to be there. And what is this introducing you to? What are you learning on the way? And how did you arrive to the Buddhist teachings eventually?
Yeah, interestingly, I was exposed to Buddhism as a child before I became a therapist.
I see.
So when I was training to become a therapist, I knew that I wanted to find some way to, if not integrate Buddhist psychology, create connections, both in my own understanding and in the treatment between these two traditions of contemporary or Western psychotherapy and ancient Buddhist psychology. So I found a graduate program that was not explicitly Buddhist, but had religion and spirituality woven into how we were exploring the psyche, how we were exploring development, how we were exploring suffering and trauma and healing from trauma. It was very influenced by Jung. It was run by a magnificent Jungian scholar named Anne Ulanov, who was also a person of deep faith. And the students in the program all came from different faith traditions. So I I was learning from Anne and the group, but also bringing my own relationship to Buddhism into that process.
So what is the psychology telling us then about suffering and healing our traumas?
Yeah. Well, suffering is front and center in Buddhist psychology. The historical Buddha Shakyamuni very famously said he only had one thing to teach: suffering and its end. And then he went on in the original teachings to suggest that we all have the capacity to understand our suffering and even to end it, but that we have to stay curious about the causes of suffering. When we get lost in the symptoms, right, when we get lost in the experience itself, and we can't use that curiosity, that deep layer of curiosity in the mind about why we're suffering, then we lose the agency that we all have. So he basically said, first of all, don't worry about it. If you're suffering, it doesn't mean you've done something wrong. It means you're human. Right? This was the first noble truth.
Yeah.
Right? The truth of suffering. And even that teaching got confusing because many people hear it and it sounds pessimistic. Oh, life is suffering. But then immediately he went to the second noble truth, the causes of suffering, and then the end of suffering through inquiry, through a path, through a lot of curiosity. And as a therapist, that's been very resonant, that when people come in, and often they're in tremendous pain for all sorts of reasons, right? They're dealing with loss. Often there's a lot of loss. They're dealing with very complicated childhood histories or some intersection of adult trauma and a complicated childhood. So initially, there's just the grip of suffering. I'm so anxious. I'm so depressed. I've given up, right? There's just the symptom. And I say that with respect because we all know those moments of being gripped by, right, suffering. But then something slowly starts to shift when together we get curious. Can we have a look at what's been going on that brought you to this place? Right? And then when people start to get curious, they start to feel like they have a little more power. They have a little more agency to do something about the suffering. And then that alone can reduce the suffering itself, even if it hasn't changed that much. Right? I mean, sometimes we don't have the power to change what we're going through. You have a child who's dealing with acute illness, right? We don't always have the power to do something about that other than to stop attacking ourselves for it, right? Or blaming, and then exploring, okay, what's happening here? What can I do with this? How can I work with it?
In a way, it's about understanding and then accepting what is and what cannot be changed, and maybe focus on what we can actually change ourselves. It's a way of surrendering, isn't it, to what is, and these circumstances that probably bring a lot of resistance in us because we wish the reality would be different. And this is why we suffer. Much of the suffering comes from our expectation that life is different. You know, what's happening in our lives should be different. So do we find anything about intergenerational or transgenerational trauma in the Buddhist ancient tradition? What's been your learning around this?
Yeah, so intergenerational trauma is something that therapists are very interested in. We now have a lot of research helping us understand that we are impacted physiologically and psychologically by what happens in prior generations. And this is really helpful to understand, because sometimes people will come into therapy and they'll feel really badly because they can't actually identify a trauma that they've personally experienced, and yet they chronically feel very anxious or a little bit distressed, afraid. And often it has something to do with a trauma that happened before they were born, right? That the parents experienced or the grandparents experienced, that then did get transmitted often through the attachment style or the attachment dynamics between a parent and a child, and are experienced by the child who's not personally been traumatized, but has been impacted by the parent who was. And so this is helpful to know that in our psyche, we're carrying at least 3 generations. And we're very sensitive beings, right? Our psyche is extraordinary in terms of what it holds. So it's a way of also reducing shame, because some people feel like their parents were basically decent, they were good enough, they had a nice grandma, they were never hungry, and still there's this chronic sense of distress. In Buddhist psychology, it's interesting because there's a multi-life view, which many contemporary Buddhists don't abide by. But in the traditional teachings, there's the notion that we reincarnate. So we are carrying in our mind stream many prior lifetimes of experience, imprints in the mind. And again, even if that doesn't resonate for people, it can be interesting even on an intellectual level to imagine.
Yes.
Right? There's something going on that's causing some symptoms or feelings, and it's hard to pin down.
Yeah. It's the karmic memory, isn't it, that we carry with us.
Yes.
And unless we bring it to our conscious mind, we're not able to dissolve it. So we will probably be trapped in that kind of pattern of reaction until we become a bit more aware. But this is not always easy, is it? Because the impact of transgenerational trauma or trauma, generally lived trauma, own trauma, experienced trauma, is quite severe at times. As you mentioned, it impacts all aspects of our beings, not just the body and the mind, but also our souls, our hearts. Some people call it energy. Our relationships, naturally, how we carry ourselves in our roles, our social persona in the world, in the many roles that we have. From your experience, what is the impact of transgenerational trauma when you work with your clients? What is it that you see as a common theme?
Well, the impact is quite diverse, but generally speaking, what I see is that people internalize beliefs about who they are and what this world is. That has a lot to do with what prior generations have lived through. So someone could be living a basically stable life. They have a job, they have enough food, they have a safe place to live, but their parents lived through a war, right? And the parents carry the seeds of that experience of feeling that life can change in an instant, right? The world is not a safe place. And even though that parent makes an effort to be kind and basically loving to the child, right? They feed them, they clothe them, they hug them. Still, it gets communicated to the child. The world is not a safe place. And that belief forms early in life and wields a lot of power. Now, for the child who becomes an adult, who then feels badly because they're leading a basically stable life and they know they're privileged, they managed to find a job, they managed to find a home, they're intelligent enough to realize many people do not have that privilege, but still they feel gripped by that belief. If they leave their home, something bad could happen. Life can change on a dime. It's often those beliefs that get transmitted, and then they form before we're verbal, before we can know what's happening.
Yeah.
Right? And then they function almost like a roadmap.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And so part of what we do in therapy is try to lift those, those beliefs and that way of navigating life to fuller awareness, which sometimes involves having a look back. What happened to your parents? What happened to your grandparents? How did that influence the family? How did it influence your relationship of, to being with others, to being in the world?
Yeah. So true, because in a way we're talking about how the collective trauma impacts our lives. We've all been through worse. I mean, not us, but our ancestors, without doubt. And we hear their stories. They lived those stories. So my grandparent, for example, my grandfather was a war prisoner in the Second World War, and he barely survived, injured, wounded. He suffered from PTSD. I wasn't aware at that time. I was very young. But now looking back, I can realize that what he actually manifested was the symptom of that post-traumatic stress, because he's witnessed some horrors. And then we're talking about millions of people that have been affected. When there's something global happening, like the pandemic or the, I don't know, the Black Death a few hundred years ago and so on, and the world, the world wars, that impacts everyone. It's our history. It's in our, it's in our blood. It goes through genetic memory as well, I would imagine, not just through stories within our cultures. So that's so important to recognize, isn't it? That it can come from other places. It doesn't have to be ours. But we know. We know what we're capable of. We know that the world has the potential to be unstable. And if we allow this fear to kick in, then naturally we will have to suffer a bit more than we already suffered. So what do we do with this suffering now? What do we do with this trauma? Is this trauma helping us in any way? How can we make this an amazing opportunity for growth, for development, for expansion? Mm-hmm. And why some people awaken and others don't and keep suffering?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Well,
tough question.
They're tough questions, but they're important questions. And my sense, this comes from personal experience as well as clinical experience, that it has a lot to do with whether or not we can access real compassion. Right? I do think it's important with trauma to recognize how painful it is. Right? I mean, it's not a gift to be traumatized. It is painful.
Absolutely.
Right? Right? When we feel like we don't know who we are, we're disoriented, we're alienated, that's real suffering. So the question is always, can we care about that suffering?
Ourselves, you mean?
Yes.
Mm-hmm.
Right? I mean, the early psychoanalysts who discovered Buddhism, including Karen Horney and others, they suggested, and this has always rung true to me, that therapy doesn't begin. We can't get real traction in our healing until we have some genuine compassion for ourselves. Which doesn't mean that we're feeling sorry for ourselves or that we're lost in self-pity. It means that there is some part that cares, right? Because to be traumatized means someone has been through something that has completely overwhelmed their ability to cope. That is not easy to go through, right?
So
And
is
so
this not a human sort of quality? Do we not all have this capacity to care, to be kind towards ourselves, towards our own wounds? How do you see this playing in our lives?
my sense, Nicoletta, is that we all have the capacity. It's within us.
Yes.
But many of us have lost touch with that capacity.
Right.
Right. Either because we had to be tough in order to survive a family or a culture or a circumstance. We had to be too tough too early in life. We had to present to others that we're feeling well when we weren't.
Oh.
And then that became a powerful habit.
Mm-hmm.
Right? Then it makes it hard to access that natural tenderness, that natural compassion.
Right.
So if that is so, if someone grew up in a family where they got, they got insulted or they were humiliated when they exposed their suffering, and then what's likely is they've internalized that response. So there's the initial suffering, and then there's a part saying, oh, come on, you're a wuss. Get over it. There are millions of other people who've been through what you've been through, and they're not lying on the floor crying, watching Netflix all night, not wanting to get out of bed, right? There's some self-humiliation that happens that replicates that original response. So whatever may have happened that makes it hard for somebody to access compassion, they're probably going to need new experiences with other people where they get a more respectful response to their suffering, where someone says, wow, you've been through a lot.
Yes.
I really want to hear more about it. Right? So that it reawakens that inner response.
Yes. It makes it safe to share, to reconnect with your true self, to reconnect with your feeling, with the true nature of who you are, because you put a lid on that as soon as you've been so hurt that you couldn't cope with it anymore, as a child in particular. But even as an adult, we shouldn't differentiate, because hurt is hurt. And even if we are now, we like to say fully developed, we're still developing, we're still growing, we're still transforming every day in terms of understanding and acceptance of what is. And I so resonate with this, because I'm working in the clinical space myself, and very often I meet clients in their 30s or 40s or 50s or even more mature that have never considered the relationship with themselves at all. So when they talk about relationship, it's all about family, friends, workmates, and so on. And I have my own 4 relationship circles where the relationship with the self is right in the middle. It's at the core of everything, because it's so important. Yes. And often we need to walk the journey back from disconnection, back into connection, so we can properly start doing our inner work.
That's right.
It's hard to hold yourself in high regard if you've never learned that, if you've not seen your parents doing it. And sometimes this space that we operate in, that we work in, creates that platform for people to feel safe for the first time, to feel valued, to feel validated, to feel observed and noticed and listened to. And it's just amazing that we can't find it within our family environment or in our group of friends because we're not conscious enough. We're not able to sit with that, the other person's pain. Let's put it this way, isn't it?
Yes. Well, this is so important because often there's a fantasy. I want to suggest this is a just pervasive human fantasy that we can only be happy when someone else provides us with what we're needing. And this comes up in therapy a lot. People are waiting for happiness when the best partner comes along, or the better boss, or the better president, you name it.
Yes.
Someone else needs to change. Someone else needs
Yes.
to provide what we've been waiting for.
Yes.
And while I'm all for having people in our life who are caring, we need those people, right? I mean, we're talking about how impactful it can be for a caring therapist to be with someone who's suffering. Ultimately, we need to contact our own capacity to be respectful in response to our struggles and curious and caring. Right, that's what we can count on.
Yeah, because in a way, the only person we can count on genuinely, it's ourselves, or the first person we should really consider is ourselves. And the happiness that we're, fantasizing about, it's actually a distraction in the outside world. It's not what happiness really is, at least not in my view, where I'm finding happiness in the connection with my true self, with the wholeness of my being, where I'm feeling really that I'm home, I'm in union. All of these parts are together and are caring for each other and are supporting each other. And then I'm fine within that space of peacefulness, even if many aspects of my life might be in turmoil. I might go through a loss, I might go through, I don't know, relationship struggles or whatever. You name it, because we all have them. That's the nature of life. Yes. So we seem to be confused around the need for suffering, or the self-made suffering in a way, and the source of happiness. And probably part of our work is channeled towards that space as well. So beautiful, Pilar. I so much enjoyed this conversation. Let's find out how we're healing this trauma. How is it that you work? What have you developed, and what's specific to your work with your clients?
Yeah. Well, it feels very connected to what we're talking about. When people start to appreciate their own capacity to heal, which begins with that tender response, that respectful, compassionate response to suffering, then what can happen is they start to realize that regardless of the trauma history, they can be in a new relationship to that trauma history. Because often there's the conviction that I cannot be happy because of what I went through, which is really understandable given what we can go through. I mean, sometimes the traumas are so severe or they're so chronic that it starts to feel like happiness is not for me. I'm not one of the lucky ones. But in both Buddhist psychology and Western psychotherapy and psychoanalysis, it is the mind that matters most. It's how we are carrying our history that matters most. Are we attacking ourselves constantly because we are somehow responsible for what we went through and should have known beforehand and circumvented the trauma? Right? Are we lost in some retroactive search for control? Or are we always going back thinking, if I'd only done X, Y, and Z, the trauma wouldn't have happened, and now I'd be happy? Which is basically, an example of chronic self-attack.
Yes, the lack of acceptance, the lack of surrendering to what already is and cannot change.
Yes. And so we can start to notice that there is some part of us, and Freud wrote about this quite a bit, that's still seeking mastery over the trauma, but in a way that's not actually going to lead to happiness. We're going over it again and again, almost with the fantasy of undoing it in the past. But what we can do now, right, is free ourselves from self-blame and kind of swap out self-blame with curiosity. What was going on? What was happening in the family when I was traumatized? What was happening in the culture? What was happening politically? What happened to my parents before I was born? There's so many questions that we can start to be curious about. And then the curiosity comes in, grows, takes deeper root. And then we're reducing all of that self-attack, right? So the system, the body, can start to feel a little safer, right? So that's a big part of healing, is noticing how are we in relationship to what we have lived through.
So beautiful. Thank you so much for that. We are now approaching the end. I wish I could ask a few more questions, but maybe next time. Pilar, can we share with our watchers and listeners, what are your best 3 teachings? Bullet points, very simple ones, to live a happy, meaningful, and fulfilling life.
Beautiful question. Well, the first one I learned from Buddhism, and it's meant a great deal to me, which is that we all have precious human life. We may not know it. We may have lost touch with that, but that is a reality, right? If someone is alive, they are deeply valuable, deeply precious. And to find ways to remember that reality so that someone can start to feel like they want to take care of themselves. They want to offer themselves that compassion because they are sacred. They are precious. The second would be to be curious about suffering, to turn toward it. Often we're tempted to distract ourselves, find temporary sources of pleasure, right? Get distance from suffering. And I know it sounds counterintuitive, but when people can start to feel safe enough to stay a little bit closer and curious, then they're going to have more power to reduce it. And then maybe lastly, to remember that we all deserve other people in our life who reflect how precious and sacred we are. We need mentors. We need a friend, right? We need someone who has a gleam in their eye when they look at us. So to not give up on finding that community, finding those people who simply help us continue to remember the truth of who we are.
Wow, that's pure wisdom, Pilar. Absolutely pure wisdom. Thank you so much. I understand you wrote a book. Would you like to say a few words about that and maybe let people know where they can purchase the book if they want, where they can find out a bit more about you and your work?
Sure, yeah. So I've written a couple books. The last one was called To Heal a Wounded Heart, and it's a memoir about my entry into therapeutic work and also how I involved my Buddhist teacher in that process. I wrote another book called Mixing Minds, which is a little more theoretical about psychoanalysis and Buddhism and how they dance together. And if people are interested in reading more, they can go to my website, which is drpilarjennings.com. And I also have an Instagram account that someone else manages for me because I can't figure out social media. But I write on it, and I write about a lot of what we've talked about. And I think that's also Dr. Pilar Jennings. So I'd be happy to hear from people and hope that those resources are helpful.
They are, without doubt, for people that are ready, for those people that are ready for this, without doubt. Thank you so much, Pilar. It's been a delightful conversation. I really, really value our time spent together today, and hopefully we can continue the conversation some other time. Blessings, and thank you so much.
Thank you. It's been a pure joy. Thank you.